The thunder of approaching hooves cut through the still morning air as Garret Wallace rode hard across the open range. The spring of 1878 had brought floods to the Texas plains, turning portions of the usually dusty landscape into a treacherous patchwork of mud and standing water. Garret hadn't expected to find anyone out here, 10 miles from the nearest homestead, but the strange movements he'd spotted from the ridge had drawn him closer. What he discovered made his blood run cold. A woman lay face down in the mud, her dress torn and soiled, with a man's boot pressed firmly between her shoulder blades. 3 rough-looking men stood over her, laughing as she struggled to free herself. "Seems we caught ourselves a real wildcat," one of them jeered, giving her another shove into the muck. Garret didn't hesitate. He drew his Colt revolver and fired a single shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the muddy plain, and the men spun around, hands instinctively moving to their weapons. "Step away from the lady," Garret called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who meant what he said. "Now." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Garret was outnumbered, but the steady aim of his revolver served as a powerful equalizer. "This ain't your business, cowboy," the largest of them snarled. "Ride on." Garret cocked his revolver. "I'm making it my business." What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to stretch for minutes, but likely lasted only seconds. Finally, the leader of the group spat into the mud. "She ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. "Come on, boys." The men backed away slowly, mounted their horses, and rode off, casting threatening glances over their shoulders. Garret kept his weapon trained on them until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he dismount and approach the woman, who remained face down in the mud, trembling. "Madam," he said softly, kneeling a respectful distance away. "They're gone now. You're safe." When she didn't move, he reached out a hand to help her up. "Don't," she whispered hoarsely, her face still hidden in the mud. "Don't look at me." Garret paused, his hand suspended in mid-air. He could see her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I see you," he said gently, "and I'm not going anywhere until I know you're all right." The woman remained motionless for several heartbeats before slowly turning her head. Her face was nearly unrecognizable beneath the layers of mud, but her eyes, a striking shade of blue, flashed with a mixture of fear, shame, and defiance. "My name is Garret Wallace," he continued, keeping his voice steady. "I've got a horse and a canteen of fresh water. Will you let me help you?" She studied him warily, like a wounded animal uncertain whether to trust a potential rescuer or flee. Finally, she gave a barely perceptible nod. With slow, deliberate movements, Garret removed his bandana and offered it to her. "May I ask your name, madam?" Her voice came out as a rasp. Charlotte Blackwood." Garret helped Charlotte to her feet with careful, respectful hands. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her without comment. He led her to a nearby stream where she could wash the worst of the mud from her face and hands. Then he offered her his canteen and jerky from his saddlebag, which she accepted with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she said, her voice still barely above a whisper, "for intervening." Garret nodded, giving her space. "You have somewhere to go, Miss Blackwood. Family nearby." Charlotte's shoulders tensed. "No, not anymore." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I was traveling to Fort Worth, my wagon, those men." She didn't need to finish. Garret had seen enough to understand. Travelers alone on these roads were vulnerable, especially women. "I've got a small ranch about 5 miles from here," he said. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, is there. You'd be safe until you decide what you want to do next." Charlotte studied him, clearly weighing her limited options. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because it's what decent folks do," Garret replied simply. "And because those men might come back. The mention of her attackers returning was enough to make Charlotte nod her agreement. "I accept your offer, Mr. Wallace, but only until I can make other arrangements." Garret helped Charlotte onto his horse, then mounted behind her, keeping a respectful distance as much as the saddle would allow. They rode in silence across the muddy landscape, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows ahead of them. Charlotte remained rigid in the saddle, her back never quite touching Garret's chest even when the horse navigated the uneven terrain. He noticed how she held herself spine straight, chin up, despite everything that had happened. There was a strength in her that impressed him. As they approached the modest ranch house, a plump older woman emerged onto the porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "Garret Wallace," she called out. "I was beginning to worry," her words cut off when she noticed Charlotte. "Oh my goodness, Mrs. Abernathy," Garret said as he helped Charlotte dismount. "This is Miss Blackwood. She's had a difficult day and needs a place to rest." The housekeeper's kind eyes took in Charlotte's bedraggled appearance without judgment. "You poor dear. Come inside this minute. I've got stew on the stove and a hot bath can be ready in no time." Charlotte looked momentarily overwhelmed by the kindness, but she managed a quiet "thank you." "I'll see to the horse," Garret said, giving Charlotte an encouraging nod. "Inside, Mrs. Abernathy fussed over Charlotte like a mother hen, preparing a bath and lending her a clean dress. Charlotte hadn't experienced such gentle care in years, and it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Now, Mrs. Abernathy said, patting her shoulder. "You're safe here, Miss Blackwood. Mr. Wallace is a good man. Finest I've known since my late husband, God rest his soul." Charlotte soaked in the warm bath, scrubbing away not just the mud but trying to wash away the memory of those men's hands on her. She had been lucky Garret had arrived before the worst could happen, but the humiliation and fear lingered. By the time she emerged from the bedroom in Mrs. Abernathy's borrowed dress, the smell of beef stew filled the small house. Garret stood when she entered the kitchen, his hat in his hands. "Miss Blackwood," he said with a respectful nod. "I hope you're feeling somewhat recovered." Charlotte nodded. "Thanks to your kindness and Mrs. Abernathy's care." They ate dinner at the small kitchen table, Mrs. Abernathy filling the silence with cheerful chatter about the ranch and the town 5 miles away. Charlotte responded politely but offered little about herself. Garret noticed how her eyes occasionally darted to the windows, as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. After dinner, Mrs. Abernathy showed Charlotte to the small guest room. "I'll be just down the hall if you need anything, dear, and Mr. Wallace is across the yard in the bunkhouse." Left alone, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the clean quilt. She hadn't expected to find safety today. Her plan to reach Fort Worth and find work as a schoolteacher seemed impossible now, with her belongings stolen and her meager savings gone. But for tonight, at least, she had a roof over her head and people who had shown her unexpected kindness. The next morning, Charlotte woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Abernathy was bustling about. "Good morning, dear. Sit. You need a hearty breakfast." Charlotte helped set the table, finding comfort in the simple domestic task. When Garret entered, hat in hand, she found herself unexpectedly pleased to see him. "Morning, ladies," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Miss Blackwood, I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected, thank you." Over breakfast, Charlotte finally shared her story or parts of it. She told them about losing her teaching position in Austin when the school closed, and her plan to find work in Fort Worth. "My wagon and all my possessions are gone now," she concluded. "I'll need to find work locally until I can save enough to continue my journey." Garret exchanged a glance with Mrs. Abernathy. As it happens, Miss Blackwood, our town is in desperate need of a teacher. The last one left 3 months ago to get married." Charlotte looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Really? Mayor's been trying to find a replacement ever since," Mrs. Abernathy confirmed. "The children are running wild with no schooling." "I could take you to town today to speak with him," Garret offered, "if you're feeling up to it." For the first time since he'd found her, Charlotte smiled, a small, cautious thing that nonetheless transformed her face. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Wallace." After breakfast, Charlotte helped Mrs. Abernathy with the dishes while Garret readied the wagon. The older woman worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before speaking. "Mr. Wallace is a good man," she said, her tone casual but her eyes shrewd. "Been on his own too long, if you ask me." Charlotte felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'm sure he has his reasons." "Lost his wife and baby to fever 5 years back," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "Threw himself into building this ranch after that. Hardly comes to town except for supplies." Charlotte didn't know how to respond to this personal information, so she simply nodded. "All I'm saying, Mrs. Abernathy added, is that kindness like his is rare in these parts, and he seems lighter since you arrived." Before Charlotte could formulate a response, Garret called from outside that the wagon was ready. She thanked Mrs. Abernathy for her kindness and stepped out into the bright morning sunshine. The ride to town gave Charlotte time to study Garret more carefully. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and strong hands that handled the reins with easy confidence. His face was weathered from years under the Texas sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had once smiled more often than he did now. His dark hair was in need of a trim, and a day's stubble shadowed his jaw. "Mrs. Abernathy told me about your wife," Charlotte said quietly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Garret's hands tightened briefly on the reins. "Thank you. It was a long time ago." "Time doesn't always heal as completely as people claim," she replied, thinking of her own losses. He glanced at her, something like recognition in his eyes. "No, it doesn't." They rode in companionable silence for a while before Charlotte spoke again. "I want to thank you properly for what you did yesterday. Most men would have ridden past." "No decent man would have," Garret said firmly. "You'd be surprised what decent men can justify ignoring," Charlotte replied, a hint of bitterness in her tone. Garret studied her profile. "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." Charlotte didn't answer directly. "I've learned that in this world women must often fend for themselves." "That may be true," Garret acknowledged, "but it doesn't mean they should have to." The small town of Willow Creek came into view, a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, including a general store, saloon, small church, and sheriff's office. People turned to look as Garret drove the wagon down the dusty street, curious about the unfamiliar woman at his side. Mayor Thompson was a portly man with an impressive mustache, who nearly wept with joy when Charlotte mentioned her teaching credentials. "Miss Blackwood, you're an answer to our prayers," he exclaimed. "We have 15 children with no schooling since Miss Peterson left us. When can you start?" They quickly negotiated terms, a modest salary plus room and board at the widow Carson's boarding house. By noon, Charlotte had been introduced to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town and given a tour of her accommodations. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Wallace," she said as they prepared to return to his ranch to collect her few borrowed belongings. "You've given me a new start when I most needed one." Garret tipped his hat. "Just glad things worked out, Miss Blackwood." Over the next few weeks, Charlotte settled into her role as Willow Creek schoolteacher. The children, initially wary of the new teacher, quickly warmed to her firm but kind approach. Parents expressed their gratitude with small gifts of home-baked bread or fresh eggs. Charlotte saw Garret occasionally when he came to town for supplies. He would tip his hat to her on the street, sometimes stopping for a brief conversation. She found herself looking forward to these encounters more than she cared to admit. One Saturday in late May, Charlotte was surprised to see Garret approaching the boarding house with a small package. "Good morning, Miss Blackwood," he said, removing his hat. "I was hoping you might join me for a walk," Charlotte agreed, curious about his unexpected visit. They strolled toward the small creek that gave the town its name, now flowing freely after the spring rains. "Mrs. Abernathy sent these," Garret said, handing her the package. "She's been worried you might be tired of Mrs. Carson's cooking." Charlotte unwrapped the cloth to find Mrs. Abernathy's famous molasses cookies. "How thoughtful! Please thank her for me." They sat on a fallen log by the creek, sharing the cookies as they talked. Garret asked about her students, and Charlotte found herself sharing amusing anecdotes about their antics. It felt good to laugh again. "You seem to have settled in well," Garret observed. Charlotte nodded. "The people here have been kind. It's starting to feel like home in a way." She hesitated before adding, "I never properly told you my full story." Garret shook his head. "You don't owe me your past, Miss Blackwood." "I think I'd like you to know," she said softly, "if you're willing to listen." When he nodded, Charlotte began her tale. She had been raised on a prosperous farm in Missouri, the daughter of a respected family. At 18, she had married the son of a neighboring farmer, a match that pleased both families. "James seemed kind during our courtship," she explained. "But after the wedding, everything changed. He had a temper, especially when he drank. At first it was just harsh words, but eventually—" She didn't need to finish. Garret's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "When my father died 2 years later, James gained control of our farm. He ran it into the ground with his drinking and gambling. When there was nothing left, he simply disappeared one night, left me with the debts and shame." Charlotte stared at the flowing creek, avoiding Garret's eyes. "I sold what little remained and moved to Austin to start over. I was lucky to find the teaching position, but when the school closed, well, you know the rest." Garret was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. I wanted you to understand why it meant so much what you did that day." Charlotte finally looked at him. "You saw me at my lowest moment, covered in mud and humiliated, yet you treated me with dignity." "You never lost your dignity, Charlotte," Garret said, using her first name for the first time. "Those men tried to take it, but they failed." The sincerity in his eyes brought tears to hers. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt truly seen, not as a victim or a failure, but as a woman of worth. Their friendship deepened over the following weeks. Garret began finding reasons to come to town more frequently, often timing his visits to coincide with the end of the school day. They would walk together, sometimes talking, sometimes enjoying comfortable silence. The townsfolk noticed. Mrs. Carson raised knowing eyebrows when Garret came calling. The general store owner, Mr. Peterson, made teasing comments when Garret purchased items that were clearly meant as small gifts for the schoolteacher: a hair ribbon, a book of poetry. One evening in early June, Garret invited Charlotte to Sunday dinner at his ranch. "Mrs. Abernathy misses you," he explained, though his eyes suggested it wasn't only the housekeeper who wished for her company. The dinner was delightful, with Mrs. Abernathy outdoing herself with a roast chicken and apple pie. After the meal, Garret suggested a walk to show Charlotte the improvements he'd made to the ranch since her brief stay. As the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they stood by the corral watching his horses graze in the evening light. "I never thanked you properly," Garret said suddenly. Charlotte looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For bringing life back to this place." He gestured around the ranch. After Mary and the baby died, I just existed. Worked from sunrise to sunset, barely speaking to anyone but Mrs. Abernathy. Then you arrived and something changed. Charlotte's heart quickened. I was only here for a night. It was enough, Garret said, turning to face her fully. You reminded me that there was still beauty in this world worth fighting for. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. I didn't come here expecting this, Charlotte whispered. Neither did I, Garret admitted, but I'm mighty glad it happened. As summer progressed, so did their relationship. Charlotte continued teaching, but she spent most weekends at Garret's ranch. They rode together across his land, picnicked by the creek, and shared quiet evenings on the porch. With each passing day, the shadows in both their eyes receded a little more. Not everyone approved of their courtship. The banker's wife, Mrs. Thornton, made snippy comments about proper mourning periods and unseemly haste. But most of the townspeople were happy to see two people who had known sorrow finding joy together. In late July, disaster struck. Charlotte was walking home from school when she noticed three familiar figures outside the saloon. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the men who had attacked her months earlier. She hurried to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding. Sheriff Miller listened to her story with growing concern. I'll keep an eye on them, Miss Blackwood. But unless they break the law here, there's not much I can do. They're dangerous men, Sheriff, Charlotte insisted. They attacked me and stole everything I owned. And if they make trouble here, I'll deal with them, the sheriff promised. But for now, they're just passing through, having a drink. Charlotte returned to her boarding house, locking the door behind her. She wanted to send word to Garret but knew he was out on the range and wouldn't return until evening. As night fell, Charlotte jumped at every sound. Just after 9 o'clock, heavy footsteps on the porch made her heart race. A knock followed, then a familiar voice that sent ice through her veins. We know you're in there, schoolteacher. Time to finish what we started. Charlotte grabbed the small derringer Garret had insisted she keep for protection and moved away from the door. When it crashed open moments later, she was ready. That's far enough, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The leader of the trio, a man with a scar across his cheek, grinned nastily. Look at you, all proper now, playing schoolmarm in this backwater town. Leave now, and I won't shoot you, Charlotte said, raising the derringer. The man laughed. That little gun won't stop all three of us. Maybe not, came a voice from the doorway. But this will. Garret stood there, his rifle aimed squarely at the scarred man's chest. Behind him, Sheriff Miller and two deputies had their weapons drawn. What followed was a brief but intense standoff that ended with the three intruders in the town jail, charged with breaking and entering, attempted assault, and when the sheriff searched their saddlebags, possession of stolen property from other victims. Later that night, as Charlotte sat wrapped in a blanket in the sheriff's office, Garret knelt before her. Mrs. Abernathy heard in town that those men were asking about the schoolteacher, he explained. I rode in as fast as I could. Charlotte reached out to touch his face. You arrived just in time, again. I'll always come for you, Charlotte, Garret said, his voice rough with emotion. If you'll let me. She leaned forward to kiss him gently. I know. The following Sunday, as they sat on Garret's porch watching the sunset, he took her hand. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about the future. Charlotte's heart skipped. Oh, this ranch is too big for one person, always has been. He turned to face her. It needs a family to make it truly come alive again. Garret, she whispered, hardly daring to hope. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a single pearl. It was my mother's, he explained. Charlotte Blackwood. I never expected to find love again after Mary died. But you walked into my life, or rather, I rode into yours, and everything changed. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, with all my heart, yes." Their wedding in September was a town celebration. The schoolchildren sang, Mrs. Abernathy cried happy tears, and even Mrs. Thornton admitted the bride looked lovely. Charlotte wore a new blue dress that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. As they exchanged vows in the small church, Charlotte thought about the journey that had brought her here from the mud of that terrible day to this moment of pure joy. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garret kissed her with such tenderness that several of the townswomen sighed audibly. The first year of their marriage brought changes to the ranch. Charlotte continued teaching but moved her classroom to a converted barn on their property so that children from outlying farms could attend more easily. Garret expanded his cattle herd and built a larger house with a proper library for Charlotte's growing collection of books. They faced challenges, of course. The drought of 1879 threatened their livelihood. Charlotte's past fears occasionally surfaced in nightmares that left her trembling in Garret's arms. His grief for Mary and their baby sometimes cast shadows over otherwise happy days. But they faced each difficulty together, finding strength in their shared determination to build a good life. Their love deepened with each passing season, growing from the initial spark of attraction into something enduring and unshakable. In the spring of 1880, Charlotte discovered she was expecting a child. She shared the news with Garret on a Sunday afternoon as they sat in the wildflower meadow behind their home. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Are you certain?" Charlotte nodded, watching his face anxiously. She knew the memories this would stir. Garret was quiet for a long moment before meeting her eyes. "I'm scared, Charlotte," he admitted, "after what happened before." "I know," she said, covering his hand with hers. "I'm scared too. But we can't let fear rob us of this joy." He drew her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the finest porcelain. "You're right. This is a blessing, and we'll face whatever comes together." The pregnancy progressed well, with Mrs. Abernathy fussing over Charlotte's diet and Garret insisting she cut back on her teaching hours. By November, Charlotte's rounded belly was impossible to hide, and the entire town seemed invested in the upcoming arrival. The baby, a healthy boy they named George after Garret's father, arrived on a cold January morning in 1881. His lusty cries filled the ranch house, bringing tears to Garret's eyes as the doctor placed the swaddled infant in his arms. "He's perfect," Garret whispered, bringing the baby to Charlotte's side. "Just like his mother." Charlotte touched their son's tiny hand with wonder. "He has your chin." "And your eyes, I think," Garret replied, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Thank you, my love, for everything." The family of three settled into a new rhythm. Charlotte reduced her teaching to 3 days a week, with a young assistant handling the other days. Garret built a cradle that he placed near the fireplace in their bedroom, and often Charlotte would find him there in the middle of the night, just watching their son sleep. As George grew from infant to toddler, the ranch thrived. Garret's careful management and Charlotte's good sense with finances allowed them to purchase additional land and hire more hands. They built a proper schoolhouse on their property, where Charlotte now taught the children of both the town and their ranch workers. In the summer of 1883, they received unexpected visitors. Charlotte was in the garden with 3-year-old George when a wagon pulled up the drive. A middle-aged couple stepped down, looking uncertain. "Can I help you?" Charlotte called, lifting George onto her hip. The woman stepped forward hesitantly. Charlotte Blackwood." It took a moment for Charlotte to place the familiar faces. "Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Reynolds." They had been neighbors back in Missouri, friends of her parents. Tears filled Mrs. Reynolds' eyes. "We thought it was you when we heard the schoolteacher's name in town." "Oh, my dear girl." The couple had been searching for Charlotte for years, ever since learning of her husband James's true character. They shared news that shocked her. James had died in a bar fight 2 years earlier, but before his death, he had gambled away land that had legally belonged to Charlotte's mother, land that was now producing oil. "The courts have ruled that the property rightfully belongs to you, Mr. Reynolds explained. "We've been trying to find you to let you know. You're a wealthy woman, Charlotte." That evening, after the Reynolds had been settled in the guest room and George put to bed, Charlotte and Garret sat on their porch discussing this unexpected turn of events. "What will you do?" Garret asked, his voice carefully neutral. Charlotte studied her husband's face in the fading light. "What do you mean, with the money, the property? You could go anywhere, do anything." She reached for his hand. "Garret Wallace, are you suggesting I might leave you and our son for oil money?" He shook his head quickly. "No, not intentionally, but this changes things. You never chose this life, not really. You were stranded here with limited options." "Is that what you think?" Charlotte moved to sit on his lap, framing his face with her hands. "I chose you, Garret. I chose this life. I would choose it again every day for the rest of my life." The tension in his shoulders eased. "I just want you to be happy." "I am happy," she assured him. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." She kissed him softly. "The money changes nothing except that now we can do more for others. Maybe build a proper school for the town. Set up a fund for families in need." Garret wrapped his arms around her waist. "Have I told you lately how remarkable you are, Mrs. Wallace?" "Not since breakfast," she teased. They stayed on the porch long after sunset, planning how to use their unexpected fortune to benefit their community while ensuring a secure future for George and any siblings that might follow. In the spring of 1884, they opened the Willow Creek Academy, a proper school with 3 classrooms, and a library filled with books from back east. Charlotte served as headmistress, hiring 2 additional teachers to help manage the growing number of students who came from as far as 20 miles away. That same year brought the arrival of their daughter, Emma, a delicate beauty with Garret's dark hair and Charlotte's determined spirit. George, now 4, appointed himself his sister's protector, refusing to let anyone but family hold her. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm of work and family, with occasional trips to Dallas or even once to St. Louis. The ranch prospered, the school flourished, and their family grew closer with each passing day. On the 7th anniversary of the day Garret had found Charlotte in the mud, they rode out together to the spot where they had first met. The landscape had changed. The floods were long gone, replaced by waving grass and wildflowers, but they both remembered the exact location. "I never ride past here without thinking about that day," Garret said as they dismounted. "How different our lives would be if I'd taken another route." Charlotte spread a blanket on the ground, setting out the picnic lunch they had brought. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. Maybe not that day, but eventually." Garret sat beside her, taking her hand. "You think so?" "I do," she said confidently. "Some things are meant to be." They ate their lunch in companionable silence, watching the clouds drift across the vast Texas sky. When they had finished, Garret pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wooden box he had clearly made himself. "I have something for you," he said, handing it to her, "to mark the occasion." Charlotte opened the box to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny painting of their children on one side and Garret on the other. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Garret fastened it around her neck. "Not as beautiful as you." "Even that first day?" she asked with a small smile. "When I was covered in mud and barely coherent, especially then," he said seriously. Because even in that moment I saw your strength, your dignity, the way you raised your eyes and faced me despite everything. Charlotte leaned into his embrace. You were the first person who really saw me in a very long time. I see you, Charlotte Wallace, Garret said, echoing the words he had spoken 7 years earlier. I've seen you from the first moment, and I'll keep seeing you until my dying day. And I see you, she replied softly. The good man who stopped when others would have passed by. The loving father who reads to our children every night, no matter how tired he is. The husband who still looks at me like I'm the greatest treasure he's ever found. As the afternoon sun began its descent, they packed up their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride home. Their children would be waiting, along with the responsibilities of the ranch and school. But as they rode side by side across the rolling landscape, Charlotte felt a sense of perfect contentment. From mud and despair had grown a love stronger than any she could have imagined. The woman who had once begged a stranger not to look at her now stood tall and proud, secure in the knowledge that she was truly seen and deeply loved. As they crested the final hill, and their ranch came into view, the house with smoke curling from the chimney, the barn where George would be helping with the evening chores, the schoolhouse where Emma would someday learn her letters, Charlotte reached over to take Garret's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. He squeezed her fingers. "For what? For seeing me, for giving me this life, for everything." Garret brought her hand to his lips. "The pleasure, Mrs. Wallace, has been entirely mine." And together, they rode toward home, toward their children, toward the future they had built from an unexpected encounter on a muddy plain 7 years before, a future filled with purpose, joy, and abiding love. Years later, long after their children had grown and started families of their own, Garret and Charlotte still occasionally rode out to that special spot. Their hair had grayed, and their faces had gained new lines, but their love had only deepened with time. On one such ride, celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary, Charlotte turned to her husband and asked, "If you could go back to that day, would you change anything?" Garret considered the question thoughtfully before shaking his head. "Not a single moment. Every step brought us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Charlotte leaned over to kiss him, as much in love with this man as she had been on their wedding day. "Here is exactly where we belong." And so their story continued, a testament to the power of being truly seen, of second chances, and of love that transforms even the darkest moments into the foundation for a life of extraordinary joy.